The Reckoning, Chapter 1, a routine stop. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows on the dusty backroads outside of a small town in the American South. Sergeant James Culpepper was on his evening patrol, the usual calm broken only by the hum of the radio and the occasional vehicle that passed through the quiet stretch of highway. Culpepper, a man of conviction and long-held beliefs, prided himself on maintaining order. To him, the road was a place of rules, and anyone who didn't adhere to those rules needed to be reminded of their place. It was just another evening until he saw a car speeding past dark windows, sleek body. It wasn't unusual to encounter speeders on these roads, but there was something about this particular car that made the officer's instincts flare. He swung the cruiser into motion, lights flashing as he pulled the car over. The vehicle rolled to a stop, and a moment passed before the door opened. Out stepped a tall, lean black man. His face, though unshaven, held a quiet confidence, his movements deliberate. He wore dark sunglasses, even in the evening light, his hand running through his thick, curly hair. As he approached evening, "Sir," the officer called out as he exited his car. He was already on edge, ready to assert his authority in a way that he knew many would expect. The driver, unfazed, reached into the car and pulled out his papers, driver's license, registration, insurance. "Evening, officer," he replied, his voice smooth and calm. Sergeant Culpepper's eyes narrowed. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, though he already had an inkling. It wasn't the speed, it was the man behind the wheel. His own biases, buried deep within, came to the surface as he sized up the driver. There was something about him that made Culpepper uneasy, a sensation he couldn't quite place. The driver nodded, his expression unreadable. "I was speeding, yes." Officer Sergeant Culpepper didn't respond right away. He glanced at the man's hands, noting how they rested on the car door in a relaxed but poised manner. A slight shift in the air, like a tension tightening, told the officer he needed to assert control. He took a step forward, his hand hovering near the weapon on his belt. "Step back," he said gruffly, a bit too loudly, as if testing his own power in the moment. The man did not flinch. He merely stepped back and said, "I'm not armed, officer." But Culpepper wasn't listening. He was still caught up in his assumptions about this man's place, about how the situation should play out. "License and registration." He demanded. The driver nodded slowly, handing over the papers without protest. "Here you go." Officer Culpepper took a moment to study them, his eyes scanning each detail. He wanted to find something, anything that could justify his growing discomfort with the situation. When he saw the name on the driver's license, his hand faltered. "Wait a minute," he said, squinting at the card in disbelief. "I know this name." The driver nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'm sure you do." Culpepper's mind raced. There was a certain weight to that name, a resonance he couldn't ignore. His thoughts immediately jumped to the headlines he had seen in the past: flashy images of success, billion-dollar deals, and international recognition. You're that guy," he stammered. "The one from all those articles. The CEO." The man nodded again. "That's right. I'm Nathaniel Blackwell." Chapter 2. The past revealed. Culpepper's heart began to race. He had seen Nathaniel Blackwell's face on the cover of magazines. Blackwell was one of the wealthiest and most successful businessmen in America, a self-made man who had risen from a background of poverty in the inner city. He had created an empire in tech, reshaping industries, empowering marginalized communities, and even influencing political landscapes. And yet, despite all that success, Culpepper had never considered that someone like him, someone who had come from nothing, could end up in a small town, in a beat-up car. Just like the rest of the people he so often judged. The officer's throat tightened. He had heard the rumors that Nathaniel Blackwell had worked his way up in part by playing the game in ways that others could not. Some whispered that his success came at the cost of bending the system, exploiting the very structures that kept Black people down. But here he was, standing before Culpepper, not in a suit or behind the walls of a luxurious office, but in a humble car, driving home just like anyone else. There was no grandeur, no entourage, just a man he had assumed was beneath him. You're not like I expected, Culpepper muttered, the shock evident in his voice. Blackwell tilted his head, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. I'm sure you thought I'd be wearing a tailored suit, driving a fancy car. Huh, Culpepper swallowed. I didn't think you'd be driving this. Blackwell's expression grew more serious. Well, sometimes it's easier to stay humble, especially when you've made it as far as I have. People get used to seeing the finished product, but they rarely see the road it took to get here. It's not all gold and glory. Sometimes it's just a regular guy trying to make it through the day for a moment. There was silence. The officer looked at the man before him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a stereotype, not as a symbol, but as a human being. He felt a shift, a small tremor of realization in the pit of his stomach. He had seen Nathaniel Blackwell as something else, someone who existed only in the abstract, who fit neatly into the categories his mind had constructed. But now, standing here, that construct began to crumble. You're nothing like I expected, Culpepper said again. His voice now quieter. Blackwell looked at him, his eyes cool but not unkind. And what did you expect? Sergeant Culpepper hesitated. The words felt clumsy on his tongue, but they needed to be said. I don't know. Maybe. Someone who plays by the rules? Someone who's like you, but not really like you. I don't know how to explain it. Nathaniel smiled softly. It's okay. I get it. But it's not about playing by the rules. It's about being true to yourself. People judge by appearances, by who you seem to be, and that's not the full story. The real story is what we choose to do with the life we have. How we stand up for others. How we rise no matter the odds. Culpepper stood there, stunned. He had spent his whole life thinking he knew how the world worked, what to expect. But now, with this man in front of him, he was seeing a different truth, one that contradicted everything he thought was real. The officer lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of his own bias pressing down on him. It was uncomfortable, but it was a necessary discomfort. I'm sorry, he muttered, a rare sincerity creeping into his voice. Blackwell nodded. Apology accepted. But don't just apologize. Learn from it. You've got a chance here to change. Chapter 3. The encounter that changed everything. The tension between the two men dissipated. Culpepper handed the license and registration back to Blackwell. You're free to go, Mr. Blackwell, he said, his tone now softer, almost respectful. Drive safe. Blackwell smiled, tipping his hat. Thank you, officer. As Blackwell drove off into the dusk, Culpepper stood in the middle of the road, the weight of the encounter settling in his chest. He had always prided himself on his ability to see things clearly, to know who people were based on how they presented themselves. But tonight, he had learned something different. He had learned that seeing isn't always the same as understanding. In the rearview mirror of his patrol car, the lights flickered off, but the lesson would stay with him, longer than any flashing lights ever would. The world wasn't as simple as black and white, and neither were the people in it.